It's very exciting to be here today. One of the joys of teaching at a university, of course, is working with students and discussing politics in action. But a disadvantage is that in the summer, they're off doing internships and other activities as much of the excitement of the presidential race is heating up, though this has been an exciting race since, I guess you could say, a year ago when Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the United States. So this is a particularly timely date to be hosting this panel. But it is a great pleasure to have a chance to discuss the presidential election today. And my thanks to the Japan Society, to Yuka, and to the ambassador for having us here. The panel today is titled The 2016 U.S. Presidential Race, the Candidates, Their Leadership, and Agenda. And our goal in this panel today is to address all three topics. We have a series of questions and areas for discussion that draw upon the history of presidential elections as well as current challenges today, particularly with respect to U.S. policy toward Asia and in particular toward Japan, and the presidential candidates' stances on key issues such as trade, defense spending, national security policy. We'll try to keep this as focused on foreign and national security policy as we can, but we do understand that key domestic policy issues may also come into the discussion. It's my great pleasure to introduce the two speakers for our panel today. I'll introduce them and we'll come up on stage and begin. Jonathan Alter is an award-winning author, reporter, columnist, television producer, and analyst. He's written 3 New York Times bestsellers, 2 on the Obama presidency, and 1 on FDR's For 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope, which was one of the Times' notable books of the year. Mr. Alter has been an analyst and contributing correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC for almost 2 decades. He spent 28 years as a columnist and a senior editor at Newsweek, where he wrote more than 50 cover stories. He is now a twice-monthly columnist for the Daily Beast. In fact, he wrote a column about Asia just last week, which we'll be discussing. And he has also written for several other publications, including The Washington Post, The New Republic, Vanity Fair, Bloomberg View, and other publications. He served as a fellow of the Japan Society in Tokyo in 1993. He is currently working on a biography of former President Jimmy Carter and producing a documentary about the lives of journalists Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill. Ms. Gloria Rivera has been with ABC News since 1999. She is currently a general assignment correspondent in the Washington, D.C. Bureau. She covers a range of breaking news, investigative, feature, and hard news stories. Her most recent reporting has focused on police brutality, race relations, abortion, sex trafficking, transgender issues, and the current presidential race. She has covered previous presidential races, most notably starting with the 2000 presidential election, where she was assistant to ABC News correspondent Sam Donaldson, and she also covered the 2004 presidential election. Before she joined the DC Bureau of ABC News, Gloria Rivera was a digital journalist covering Asia for ABC News. She was based in Beijing for close to 3 years, where she reported on a wide range of hard news, investigative, and feature stories. She's reported on cybersecurity, pollution, U.S.-China relations, human rights, Edward Snowden, the National Security Agency, and much more. She has won several awards for her news coverage, including an Emmy for breaking news coverage of 9/11. And she also won the Alfred DuPont Award for her work on the special 9/11 Answering Children's Questions in 2003. Please join me in welcoming our 2 panelists to this discussion. Well, to start this discussion, I have specific questions for each of you, but there's a study in that the East-West Center produced recently on called "Why Asia Matters to America," and you can find this on the East-West Society's website. They talk about the policy positions of the presidential candidates, at this point the presumptive nominees Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, And they also discussed the expertise of the of the candidates in foreign affairs. And I'm just, excuse me for pulling this up, but I want to make sure I get the numbers exactly right here, because it was telling to me what they said. The numbers, Hillary Clinton has had 61 official visits to Asia while she was Secretary of State and 19 visits while she was First Lady, so 80 total. And of course has an extensive record in, oversaw the Obama administration's rebalance to Asia. As First Lady, gave a famous speech on human rights during the 1995 World Conference on Women in Beijing, and was very active in U.S. foreign policy as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee as well, before her Secretary of State career. Donald Trump, businessman, has had no official travel to Asia. His selected experience and Asia connections, as listed by this group, by the East-West Society for Asia Matters for America, is that he owns property in the Philippines and South Korea and has ongoing projects in India. So my first question, and this is a serious question, is how much does experience matter for the presidency, particularly with respect to U.S. interests in Asia as we look ahead to 2017?
Well, since I'm chomping at the bit on this, it doesn't matter very much in terms of being elected. The voters generally don't care much about experience. There's very, very little evidence of them ever electing somebody on the basis of experience. It doesn't always have much to do with your ability to govern. You could look at a number of different presidents, but take our current one. He had stopped by the U.S. Senate for a cup of coffee before he was elected president, and really did not have significant experience. But he did have life experience abroad, and had grown up partly in Indonesia, and he'd been interested in international relations since he was in college, and was an ardent student of international relations. So one's official experience needs to be distinguished from one's self-education. And the problem with Donald Trump, and I need to preface this by saying, I believe that a journalist's role is to get as close as possible to the truth, not to some phony sense of balance or some phony notion of objectivity. And the truth is that he is profoundly unprepared to be president of the United States. He's a profoundly ignorant man, and he's a demagogue. And so the question that the voters in this country are facing is whether we are prepared to take an extraordinarily risky bet. I would argue the riskiest bet that we have taken, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, in terms of making him president. So he has no experience, but worse than that, he hasn't compensated for his lack of experience by studying the issues, informing himself at even a rudimentary level, and it's frightening.
Jonathan said before he was not going to hold back on how he saw things. And I think that was a terrific start. I think if you look back in recent years, several candidates, exactly as Jonathan pointed out, lacked significant foreign experience, but all in different varieties. You had Ronald Reagan, you had George Bush, 43, sorry, my brain's a little bit, I've been covering Orlando all week, so excuse me if I'm a little bit slow, but you had several candidates who were criticized during the election cycle for not having overseas experience. It actually, Trump, there is precedent. It has been 60 years since someone was elected who had no experience, either as a governor or in Congress, but that person was Dwight Eisenhower, who happened to be Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in World War II. So he had some experience under his belt that Donald Trump simply does not. But voters often vote from the heart, and that can often be can circumvent the actual facts on the resume.
There is only one person who, in the 20th century, much less the 21st, who came out of the business world with no experience and was nominated for president. And that was a utility executive named Wendell Willkie, who in 1940 was nominated. But Wendell Willkie was extraordinarily interested in international affairs. And after he lost to Franklin Roosevelt that year, he wrote a book called One World, which was so impressive. It was a big bestseller. It was about how interconnected we are. It's something that at the time was, had not yet ripened as an idea. But it was such an impressive piece of writing and analysis about the interconnectedness of the world that Roosevelt, who'd just beaten him, had him into the White House, and they discussed it and discussed joining forces, and then Willkie died suddenly. So that's the only precedent of somebody coming from the business world to the nomination that we have. If you go back to the 19th century, Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, business guy, I guess, if he was an editor, was nominated for president in 1872. But there are very, very few examples of this. And, I think people would be, it's not that they reject the idea of a businessman, it's this particular businessman, which we can get into.
And we will. It's interesting that both of the examples that you've brought up, Wendell Willkie and Dwight D. Eisenhower, in presidential studies, we've been focusing on this for the past year. Are there parallels? Is there a case in history? And Willkie comes close, but of course, Wendell Willkie represented the more internationalist wing of his party, was actually closer to FDR in foreign affairs, was in some ways selected as the candidate to overcome the isolationist wing of the Republican Party in 1940. So it was much more, I think, in sync with establishment perspectives on the U.S. role in the world in 1940.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that one of my mentors, an old boss, is a guy named Charlie Peters, who's the founder of a magazine called The Washington Monthly, a wonderful little political magazine. He wrote a book called 5 Days in Philadelphia about Willkie's nomination in 1940, and he was running against isolationists for the Republican nomination. And Peters argues that if Willkie had not been nominated, an internationalist, that the draft, which passed by one vote in the fall of 1940, and then the renewal of the draft also passed very, very narrowly in 1941, and that wouldn't have been possible if Willkie hadn't been nominated, to bring enough Republicans along to have a draft. If we hadn't had a draft at Pearl Harbor, we would have been unprepared to fight World War II, and it would have been much, much harder for the United States to win World War II. So that Willkie nomination was pivotal.
Right. Yes. And the comparison to Eisenhower, of course, I think, Larry, you bring out well. Obviously, Eisenhower's was steeped in national security experience and had actually a very political career, albeit in the military. But as we kind of trace his his rise in the military, was someone who was certainly steeped in politics.
And I think early on, George Bush made it very clear that he was going to reach into his father's cabinet. And those names that came out early in the campaign were very familiar to voters, and they brought a sense of security for what he was really being hit hard on throughout that campaign. He brought out the names Rumsfeld, Cheney, Powell. These were names that voters were familiar with and that gave them a sense of security and something to have a very quick rebuttal when the Democrats came after Bush for his lack of expertise. I think actually that campaign handled that very well and checked that box and were able to move on from it. And we've seen nothing like that in any sense with Trump. We're just waiting and waiting. And yet, when you talk to voters in anticipation of this event, I have been fascinated with finding people to have conversations with about why they support Trump, particularly as the year has progressed. And I found both in my personal life and as a reporter out on the trail, being surprised at the people who have said, wait a minute, there's something that resonates with me. And I've heard often, this is just in the last couple of weeks, but he calls things out. He just exposes things. This is a woman, very religious. Pastors need to be politically correct, and Donald Trump is not politically correct, and I love that about him. And he's very sincere. The more they try to attack him, the more we love him. And that brought up a conversation that followed about the U.S. as being on the defensive and this very popular idea of that we need to go on the attack. And so you do find people who will say things, I mean, it's almost as if there is a huge disconnect between the facts and this persona that he's projecting and how they interpret that as our foreign policy will be fine.
There's interest in America first, right? And whatever,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Everything else, right? If we protect America, then everything else will work out one way or another. Well, that actually raises a question about the election, and I will pivot back to foreign policy. But is there a path to the White House for Donald Trump? A few weeks ago, it seemed possible when Senator Cruz announced that he was that he wouldn't continue his campaign. He was suspending his campaign, and there seemed to be glimmers in the Trump candidacy. It's kind of hard to even say a campaign because it's such a small group of reaching out to the Republican National Committee, of trying to kind of build support. But that's all kind of that's shifted a bit. And when you look at the Electoral College maps, and this is something that comes up frequently in discussions of the politics, you don't need to win the popular vote, as we know from 2000, right? All you need are 270 Electoral College votes. And if you look at Real Clear Politics or 270 to Win or any of these websites and all of the different permutations, I just checked them all this morning, every single one has Hillary Clinton either has her ahead, and I think all but two predictions as of mid-June have her above 270. So it looks to me that at this point in time, with the election still granted 5 months away, that the path for Donald Trump is narrowing, if there ever was a window. But obviously the keys here are Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Virginia, New Hampshire. A lot can happen in those swing states. And for both of you, from your expertise in covering campaigns, and particularly in looking at this campaign, is there still a path to the White House for Donald Trump?
Yes. I don't think it's a likely path. I think Hillary's the clear favorite for a lot of reasons that we can talk about. But we live in a two-party system, and despite the emergence of Libertarian Party, which might take some support away, especially from Trump, when you get the Republican nomination, you basically get 45% right there. And then the election is 40 to 45% done. You don't have to do anything to get it. And then, the election is about that 10%, right? And it's true that Democrats have had an advantage in the Electoral College, and it's true that Trump has had a terrible couple of weeks. But in the same way that things shifted from the way they looked a couple of weeks ago to the way they are now, they can shift again and shift again and shift again. There's a long time before the election, and I've seen too many candidates I've covered blow leads. That's quite a common occurrence. I mean, just to give you one example, in 1988, when I was covering Bush versus Dukakis, Dukakis had a 17-point lead in some polls in the middle of the summer, and he lost by a pretty considerable margin. So a 12-point lead, which is the latest and worst poll for Trump, is not very big, and in recent weeks, he's been within the margin of error in some polls. So I think to say that he can't win would be very premature at this point. But he's made some terrible mistakes that have not gotten very much attention. And I think the most recent one was the way he responded to Orlando. Politicians are judged by how they respond. And it seemed for a while when people talked about how Trump could possibly be elected that if there was, I said this myself last fall, he can win if there's a terrorist incident. Because after San Bernardino, he went up in the polls. And so if there's a terrorist incident and he plays on people's fears, that could take him to the White House. But he overplayed his hand, and he reacted in a self-congratulatory and tone-deaf fashion. and I think he really hurt himself rather than helping himself in the last few days. It's possible that if there's several more terrorist incidents between now and the election, that people will come back to him. But for right now, it seems like Hillary is getting the better of the argument on how to respond to these things. And then the other terrible mistake that Trump is making is he's so arrogant that he's just completely blown off the whole industry that has developed on, around how you get elected president, and how you raise money, how you spend that money. And he truly believes that his brilliance at manipulating the media and his brilliance in social media, up to a point, will carry him all the way to the White House. And free media, as they call that, is only part of what you need to do to get elected. And he has neglected, and I think it's too late for him to catch up in a significant way, a lot of the rest of the blocking and tackling that has become a fundamental part of getting elected president.
So even with these mistakes, there's still a route. And it is true, the swing states, when you look at the polls, at this point, as of this morning, Hillary Clinton was ahead, but not by much. I mean, many of them were under 5 points. So
Right.
Yeah, that's
there's
margin of error.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you're in it. I mean, I agree with what Jonathan said. I also, our polling shows, our numbers, our research on the primaries were interesting. Well, first off, unfavorability numbers, 7 in 10 Americans now finding Donald Trump, and that's what his unfavorable rating is. But Hillary is also struggling. She's at 55%. So you've got these two candidates that are very handicapped by severe numbers that have fallen. His unfavorability has increased by 10 in the last week due to the events of the last week that Jonathan described. And I think when you look at the primary numbers on both sides, for the Democrats, liberal voters identified themselves as on the further left side, stayed pretty steady through 2004, 2008, 47, mid-47s, but that soared to 67% in this primary. It also happened for the conservatives, stayed rather steady, but we are at a new high for them at 76%. And what happens at that point...
That's self-ID? What is it?
Yes. But what can happen is that leaves moderates, you have moderate numbers participating in primaries that falls, and that fell to a new low for both parties in this case. In 1980, moderates were at 54% in the Democratic primary. This year, at 32% on the GOP side. Moderates peaked at 51% in 1976. This year, 22%.
Wow.
So it becomes this mathematical game of trying to sort out as you go forward in the next 5 months, where will your primary voters be? And how do you get those moderates if those are who you need? And then you divide by gender, by race, by all the issues that come. And they're both, it's an uphill battle for both for those moderate votes.
Right. Well, if we, let me shift toward foreign policy. And since that is part of what our focus is tonight, and particularly U.S. policy toward Asia, China, Japan, Korea in particular. Jonathan, you wrote a column in the Daily Beast last week titled, "As President, Trump's Asia Pivot Will Be Toward War." And in that column, you explained why you think this is likely, not just one, but potentially multiple conflicts.
Yeah.
Many leaders in other countries and international audiences have said that they don't want to see Trump as president. But interestingly, there has been some commentary suggesting that Trump, for some international audiences, would be a more appealing president because he could be, because his lack of knowledge could hinder U.S. interests. I mean, I just read this today, that as far as kind of U.S. policy toward China and trade policy, that Hillary Clinton knows the issues well and will protect American interests much more effectively, would do so, more so than Donald Trump.
Right.
Can you...
Well, I mean, there are people around the world who like him. Authoritarians in every country admire him. Vladimir Putin admires him. Chinese hardliners have expressed respect for him because of his hardline approach. I think I should explain why I think he'll get us into a war. If you look at how wars start through human history, they almost always start with insults. You don't, even if there's a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor or whatever, it didn't really come out of the blue. It came after a prolonged period of deteriorating relations between the United States and Japan, and real criticism. And so taunts are what starts wars. Now, obviously, at a more fundamental level, territory, resources, other things that they're fighting over. But if you're looking at the trigger, the immediate trigger, it's usually, as in most things, it relates to human beings and the way they relate to each other. So the key two words that have come out of Donald Trump's mouth, and there are many such words that have come out, are in an interview that he did recently with Megyn Kelly of Fox. And those two words are times 10. So what he said was that when he was attacked or criticized or whatever, it was his approach to respond, quote, times 10 to what they do to me. That's what he said, times 10 to what they do to me. When you become president of the United States, do to me becomes due to the United States. So when somebody insults, or if there's a skirmish in the South China Sea or whatever, instead of having a proportionate response, which has been the policy of the United States for a very long time, Donald Trump, as a matter of principle, it's actually one of the only things that I think he truly believes. Almost everything else for him is just instrumental to whatever his objective is or the needs of his ego. This he believes, that you don't initiate. He tries to be nice to people, but if they criticize him, he will respond times 10. And we saw that all throughout the campaign, and we've seen it all throughout his career here in New York. So when you apply that to foreign relations, it is a recipe for war.
I guess let me just add one point, and then I want to, because I guess we know that Donald Trump is strong on bluster, but do his actions to date? I mean, he hasn't had a chance to exercise leadership in foreign policy, but I'm just thinking in domestic policy with gun control, right? There are signs that he would try to push his party toward more restrictions than have ever been.
Because he's choosing between his policy. He has to choose between his loyalty to the NRA, which is not a very long-standing. It's just he used to be pro-gun safety. And his big issue is terrorism. So he's going to side with that on this issue of terrorists. It's a ridiculous idea of terrorists being able to get guns when they can't even get on planes. So I don't think that's particularly meaningful. But in foreign relations, you have to think about, I think the easiest thing to do is, because it's a little hard to jump to a shooting war, hypothetically. But he's clearly on record in favor of a trade war. He said, the quote is, "What the hell is wrong with a trade war?" And if he really thinks, he's been talking about a 45% tariff on Chinese goods. He also believes that Japan has been taking us for a ride. And the president doesn't need Congress to start a trade war. Under our system, it can be done unilaterally. So, will he put on a 45% tariff? Probably not. But he'll start escalating the tariffs. Japan and China and other nations will respond in kind. We'll suddenly have a trade war. Economists say we'll lose 4 to 5 million jobs immediately. And bad things, then a whole series of other bad things happen. My point on real war is that the dynamic is basically the same. That at a certain point you have to back up your bluster with action. You can't just threaten action. And so if you say, if those in the South China Sea, if they fire again on, on that vessel in territorial waters, we're going to have to respond. And my point is that when he responds, who is going to restrain him from responding in the way that has been natural to him for his entire career, which is with overwhelming force? There's never anything proportionate about his response. It's very dangerous.
I taking up, just one example, China in recent years, the South China Sea. The diplomacy that goes on both within the administration here in the U.S. and interacting with our partners in China, in Japan, is so delicate, which is a word that you would not apply to Donald Trump.
This is a big point.
And when you dispatch a plane to fly over the islands or near the islands, that is a massive move and decision that carries a great message. But whether or not a Trump administration would see that as packing enough punch, I wonder. So you look at Clinton and you look at the case of Chen Guangcheng and when he sought refuge in the U.S. Embassy, and it was right before she was due to come over for meetings in China, and the situation got worse and worse. So this is a human rights activist who escaped. He sought refuge in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and there were some very fraught days there as the U.S. and the embassy team on the ground tried to figure out what to do with him and how to do it. And I remember that Clinton came in as it was looking grim. The U.S. was having trouble finding a solution that was good for all sides, for this human rights activist who the Chinese had very distinct decisions about what they wanted to do with him and what he should do, and what the U.S. obligation was. It was, again, that word, it was a very delicate situation. And Clinton came in and, to her credit, she managed to resolve the situation quickly. But those, and the speed with which she resolved it was of great value at the time to the U.S. It was resolved. Now, you can argue whether or not it was resolved in a way that was the best result, but she was able to deal with it and move on. And I worry that, again, the ability to act in a diplomatic fashion is not something that's in Donald Trump's tool shed right now. On the trade issue, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this partnership with these 12 countries that was signed in February. Obama's hoping Congress will ratify that. Donald Trump said of it in November, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was designed for China to come in, as they always do, through the back door and totally take advantage of everyone. Well, that's all well and good, but China is not part of the TPP partnership, so I can't even start to get into that. There's so many problems with that.
Not only that, but TPP in many ways was designed to make sure that China did not dominate trade. It's in many ways an anti-China trade deal.
Well, if the U.S. doesn't approve it, then that gives an opening to China.
Gives a big opening to China. So, and she, it may be that, who knows what's going to happen with that. Some people think it would go through in a lame duck session when members of Congress have, 2 years before they have to face the voters again, and they'll just hope everybody forgets and pass it, since most people want the deal, and other people think it'll be a lot more complicated than that if Hillary's president next year, because she's had to back away from it to a certain extent. But it's hard to see how it passes if Trump is president. And, his whole rocket fuel was protectionism initially. I think he doesn't believe in much, but he is locked into a few things that would be very hard for him to back away from. Another really common trope is that, it doesn't really matter that much who's president. I saw Ian Bremer said that about the economy. He's a brilliant guy. This was complete rubbish, what he said. It matters hugely to the economy who's president. And we can talk about that if you want to, but I guess one of the main observations I've had, I've been covering politics since the early 80s, is that the character of an administration really does flow from the top. If it's bad, the fish rots from the head, and if it's good, the fish, guides its way through the waters from the head. And a lot of it is almost by osmosis. It's not the president necessarily giving orders. It's that people anticipate what they think the president wants. And then even if they're very smart people, very dedicated public servants, the administration takes on the character of the president. And that has many, many implications that go way beyond issues that are debated in a campaign. And it relates to literally thousands of small decisions inside the government. If enough of the wrong ones get made, you have serious problems. So I say to people, I know you're probably thinking, wow, this guy really, his hair is on fire, what little he has left. But, I'm going all to cash if Trump's elected. 100% to cash.
And you wrote the book about FDR. So
yes,
FDIC.
because there are so many ways that an ignorant, demagogic president can wreck the American economy. Just to give you a couple of little examples, Trump loves litigation. He's been involved in 3,500 lawsuits. Innovators hate litigation, right? This is why, everybody in Silicon Valley is against Trump. They hate that kind of thing. It's one of the problems they have with the Democratic Party is they think it's in the pocket of trial lawyers, but it's nothing compared to Trump's attitude toward litigation. Or to use another example, if you talk to business people internationally, what do they want most? What do they care about above everything else, even more than tax cuts? Stability, predictability, reliability. They want to know that they can be confident in that their investments will be in a stable, made in a stable environment. And even when it comes to regulation, they just want to know what they're dealing with. They don't want uncertainty and unpredictability. Trump, again, like this times 10 thing, he prides himself and has repeated over and over again that he's unpredictable. That's his stock and trade. And so if you have this kind of vacillating economic policy and you have a trade war and you have a climate where business doesn't feel confident that the United States is not being run by what I like to call banana Republicans, they've got plenty of other places they can invest. This idea that they can only invest in the United States is ridiculous in today's global economy. So my big thing that I think the press is not doing enough of is on this question of the economy. Because if Trump wins, the reason he's going to win is not because the United States is a nation of bigots, not because everybody's so stupid that they're manipulated by Trump. It's because the swing voters in the suburbs, middle managers, the people who often decide presidential elections, go, you know what? Hillary Clinton has never put anybody to work. She's never met a payroll. I don't like a lot of what comes out of Donald Trump's mouth, but he's employed thousands of people and created thousands of jobs. He knows business. It's time to try a businessman. That's the only path, and answer your first question, that's his only path to the White House, is that people go, it's time to try a businessman in the White House. And you hear a lot of that. I do when I talk to voters. So the job, one of the top jobs of the press, is to explain what kind of a manager of the economy he would be. And so far what the press has been doing is saying, well, he's not really a very good businessman. He's not as rich as he says he is. People's reaction to that is, okay, he only has $1 billion instead of $10 billion. Right. It's still pretty good. Or, okay, he cut corners and he stiffed creditors and he went bankrupt. We don't care. What they believe is that he will improve their 401k.
Yeah.
And until we educate people about some of these details of economic policy that relate to what happens if you have a trade war, what happens if you have an unpredictable economic environment, he will continue to get traction on those grounds.
Well, the question of education actually applies to foreign policy as well, I think. There was a book, Michael Armacost, the former head of the Brookings Institution, published a book last year, Ballots, Bullets, and Bargains, American Foreign Policy and U.S. Presidential Elections. And in it, he points out that the American political system is structured in such a way that there is very limited room for detailed foreign policy analysis in election years, right? I mean, you have more slogans, you have limited opportunity for reflection, there's little incentive for bipartisanship. TPP is not going to go anywhere this year. The Supreme Court nomination, right, is DOA. And so Armacost raises some proposals for changing the structure of the political system. I think those are we could potentially engage those down the road later this evening. But I think that the more immediate question for both of you as members of the media is, how much more can the media do? And Gloria, this comes to what we were talking about earlier about changes in news coverage from 2000, 2004 to 2016. Because in all fairness, Jonathan, I've been looking up information on PolitiFact, on all of these fact checkers. The information is out there. Everything Donald Trump says about TPP, about nuclear weapons, about withdrawing from NATO, right? About his comments about Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and kind of this uncertainty about what he would do. All of these positions continue to be checked, questions, the comment about TPP last November. But if the information is out there and people aren't listening, what else can the media do? Or what, if anything, can the Clinton campaign do if voters aren't really interested?
I mean, I think it's a really good question because it's a big question. You're right. I mean, I look towards my colleague in the news business, Jake Tapper, who last week pushed Trump 23 times in a single interview to answer a question, and he just wouldn't do it. And at a certain point, look, news is a business, and we have gotten slammed for example, putting Trump on the air when he phones in. We never had candidates phone in to our morning shows before to have a chat, but Donald Trump's on the phone with George Stephanopoulos several times a week. And all the networks have been criticized for giving him more airtime because the argument goes, it's good for ratings. It's a dangerous, dangerous place to be. I think one thing structurally in how we communicate to voters, we're not there yet, but directed reporting through social media in the future may play a greater role. It's not there yet. The market for it, I don't think, has matured. So I think the onus is on news organizations to back off the drama. This is a reality television star who knows how to play a character that plays into people's interests and plays into ratings in a very dangerous, dangerous way. And the Clinton campaign, from what I understand, Jonathan can speak to this more than I can, I think, a sophisticated, experienced team who never in a million years thought they would be facing Donald Trump. Yeah. And there are two sides to the argument. Either they're ready to just slay it and are just waiting for the moment to pounce. And I think even in the last week, we've seen Hillary become more directed, more pointed, a little bit stronger in her sharp criticism of Trump. But it's a dangerous game for Hillary to get in the ring with someone as potentially nasty as Trump, because her problem is favorability on relatability, on someone who cares about me. It's almost as if you can make the argument that the candidate she needs to be plays directly into who voters have a problem with her being.
Right.
But I think she found the right key recently. It took her a little while, but I think the speech she gave in San Diego last week, I think she's finding her voice a little bit better, which is to be very tough with Trump, but also measured and not get into, what Marco Rubio was doing, sort of this kind of really juvenile insult land. So she makes, I think, very reasoned critique, but I agree with you that they don't ultimately know how to handle him because it's politics versus a reality show. And it may be the other path to Trump's victory is that we have turned into such an entertainment nation that people aren't ready to cancel the show yet. Mm-hmm. You know, they want to see how season 2, 2017 goes. They don't, you know, they're not ready to cancel it. And
It's going to be great.
And so that I think really does play to Trump's advantage. For the press, the media, you know, I don't know if saying that he can no longer call in makes sense, but when he does call in, the questions have to be tougher. I think actually Jake Tapper did a great job in that interview, and that hurt Trump badly because even Paul Ryan had to say that his view on Judge Curiel was racist. But you have to stick with it, and I want everybody who interviews Trump to watch a radio talk show host in Wisconsin, whose name is Charlie, what's his last name? I had him on my radio show. I'm forgetting his last name right now. And he's a very conservative talk radio host who helped get Scott Walker elected. And when Trump went on his show, he just destroyed him, like on the issues, and you know, knew how to cut in on him, knew how to ask him questions that revealed how poorly informed he was. What happens on the national shows is that they just get horse race questions, you know, and you know, kind of inside the beltway story of the day questions instead of about campaign issues, instead of about real issues about how you would govern the way we're talking about tonight. Because they think if they ask him a trade question that it's boring, you know, God forbid you have a boring question on Good Morning America or whatever. So that everybody, you know, moves to the conventional kind of question, the newsier question, instead of staying focused on the only issue that matters, which is how he or she would govern. Everything else is noise. And so the big problem with the press is that they don't stay focused enough on that real question of how they would govern. And there are lots of other kinds of stories you can do if you use that as your frame. And to go to the business part of it, you know, you go to Silicon Valley and you find out, you know, hey, there's a business guy. Aren't you happy? There's going to be a business guy in the White House, Donald Trump. He knows how to negotiate. He understands business. See what they say. You know, go to other CEOs in various industries. Go to Wall Street. You know, there are no banks on Wall Street that will lend to Trump. When he borrows, he can't borrow on Wall Street because he's stiffed so many bankers over the years. You know, and these are things that people need to know. Now, most business people don't have the courage to say it on camera, but there are enough, particularly if they're former CEOs, who will. This is the kind of thing that's central, and not just to foreign policy experts, but you know, to talk to people who have experience in government, who don't get interviewed very often. I mean, I haven't seen anybody interviewing Brent Scowcroft, who was, you know, worked for Reagan and Bush. You know, what does he think about Donald Trump as president? Given that the Bushes don't like him, I would imagine the answer is he thinks he would be dangerous. But you know, he's not the kind. People are too busy interviewing, you know, Reince Priebus or whatever. You know, and they're off the basic issue.
Yeah, I just want to add something. I mean, I want to. It's a tricky situation for everyone in the media right now. I mean, do you put him on? Do you not put him on? Clearly, we need to take him seriously, and there was a moment when we didn't take him seriously. So, I think you have to keep pushing, like that. Those 23 times that Jake Tapper went back at Trump, that is what we have to keep doing, and something eventually will happen. He will either break down and actually answer the question or keep pushing back, and we have to keep going after him. And now to the question of, you know, in any broadcast, do you, get him on the phone every day? It's not every day, and you have to engage, and there is this interesting dynamic between moving the story forward and the way that the candidates interact with each other. I think news plays an incredibly important role in that dance, right? So I don't know. I know that the criticism that comes to the media is that it's indulgent, it's for ratings, but I think there's a very good argument that it's neither. This is the campaign season that we have in front of us, and we have to ask the questions. And listen, if Donald Trump isn't going to come in the studio and sit down across from someone because he may know he'll get slammed 23 times, but he's willing to get on the phone, then there's a very good argument that you get him on the phone and do it.
I mean, I take a harder line on this then, and this will never happen, but I think that the press should say, if you're going to ban the Washington Post and these other news organizations, we're not going to go to your press conference. And you just
Right.
get everybody in the traveling press to sign a thing saying until the Washington Post's credentials are restored and until anybody with a news organization that has a circulation of over a certain amount is automatically granted access to his press conferences, you'll just talk to an empty auditorium. Otherwise, the press is just being manipulated. But people are so competitive in the press that they worry that, well, somebody won't do that. But I actually think in this case, if the heads of news organizations got together, they could try to do that. It requires some leadership in the press that we haven't seen.
What would the tipping point be? I'm just curious. I mean, it would just be that would be incredible.
I think everybody would sign. I think it could be done. It's just it takes somebody to take the leadership role.
Well, they're just such different standards. I'm going to ask two more quick questions, and then we can open it up for discussion. But Hillary Clinton has kind of been raked over the coals for her private speeches, right? Why won't she release the transcripts, et cetera? Donald Trump is the only presidential candidate who has never released his taxes, and he continues to be asked about it, but he
Bernie
continues to
Sanders
resist.
also didn't release his taxes.
But he's not the presumptive nominee. Well, right. I mean, if you look at people who ran, but didn't get the
you're
nomination,
right. You're right.
But
Of the nominees, yes.
And it seems as though at this point that he may well make it to November 8th without releasing his returns. Now, how is that possible, or how does the Clinton campaign combat this when the rules are different, right? When it just seems that when the rules are different, not necessarily by the media certainly pressed him on taxes, but the public, right? I mean, there's a suspicion or distrust with her, whereas with him, he's a businessman. There's less interest.
I mean, I don't know. I think that it does lie in getting the public interest to coalesce around some kind of pressure, right? In the past, there's been this feeling that it's the public's need to know, and I think up until this point, it's been the media pushing him. Whereas it may be an issue that's playing into that bravado that resonates with voters. Like, he doesn't need, again, he's made $1 billion, so it's not $10 billion. He's made $1 billion. He's doing something right. We don't need to see his records. I don't know. It's an enigma to me. I would like to see his tax records.
I don't think they're going to be able to get them. I mean, because they would show that he gives almost nothing to charity. We already know that his idea of charity is to give, golf passes to the heads of charities so that they can play on his golf course, and then he writes that as charity. That was in the financial disclosure statements that he released. So we know he gives very little to charity already. Tim O'Brien of Bloomberg wrote a book. He saw his tax returns after Trump sued him, and he's they're under seal. He can't talk about it, but it's pretty clear that from Tim O'Brien's book that Trump is much less wealthy than he claims. But I agree with you. I don't think that matters to anybody. And Romney waited until pretty late in the campaign before he released it. So to me, that's not something that will change, but the press has a way of forgetting about things and going, oh, we asked him about his taxes last spring. And even though a lot of the 130 million people who are going to vote aren't paying attention until after Labor Day, we did that story last spring, so we're not going to go back to that because it needs to be new. So my feeling is that the definition of news in a campaign needs to change profoundly. And that because of all this information that you talked about that's out there, there's so much information out there, so much more than there used to be. You can't escape the news because of push emails and everything. It's in your face all the time. So the standard should no longer be, has this never been reported before, which has been our standard of news for a long time. Is it brand new? And the new standard should be, do the people know?
Right.
And if the people don't know,
You have to keep doing it.
you have to keep doing it, even if you're repeating yourself, even if you're boring yourself by doing the same story, even if you're taking a story that ran a year ago and putting it on your website again, as if it was new. That's our responsibility to do.
I mean, it reminds me of the famous Edward R. Murrow, sort of mantra, telling people what, like this idea that news organizations have, the onus is on us to decide what needs to be, what you need to know every day, every morning when you wake up. And if it doesn't seem like it really sunk in, let us tell you again. But you're right that the news cycle, we move on very quickly. And I think increasingly, going back to your question a few minutes ago about how political coverage has changed, and Jonathan, really you're the expert on this, but I feel like since 2000, we get sidetracked so much more easily, and we go down these little paths and dark hallways, and then we come back and we get back on track. But there's so much noise and theatrics increasingly with every campaign. I mean, I covered in 2003 and 4 John Edwards as a presidential candidate and then a vice presidential candidate. And then I would argue the story of John Edwards was much bigger and got much more airtime after Kerry and Edwards lost. That story kept going. And for me, that was a pivot. Why are we still interested in John Edwards at this point? It was a very personal and dramatic story, and certainly arguably relevant as someone who had been a national candidate. But that was a pivot for me, that became something other than political journalism.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'll bring it back to two policy issues for my last question: immigration and trade, because it seems to me that this is where they've become two defining issues in this campaign. The New York Times had a story a few weeks ago about all of the problems with the proposal to build a wall between the United States and Mexico: engineering problems, environmental problems, legal problems. We've talked a little bit about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the analysts point out that if the United States if Congress doesn't approve the TPP, this is not in U.S. interest. That actually that's an opening for China, right, in the Pacific. Not that the partnership is designed to keep U.S. leadership there. Is there a way? Clearly, Donald Trump is resonating with a segment of the American public, and it's a third to more. Right, this is a sense that people have been left behind. What's the American dream in the 21st century? Are we thinking of the United States first? Is there a way to address those concerns and still move forward with issues like immigration and trade in a way that are kind of in a nonpartisan way that are clearly in U.S. interests?
That's such a good question, and it's so hard right now, and this relates to the Democratic Party not having paid enough attention to what happened to industrial workers when we moved to an information economy. And they got a lot of lip service, but they were left behind, and unions were allowed to atrophy, and others who were advocating for these folks did not have a big voice in the debate. And I think that's part of the Sanders phenomenon, is that's beginning to change now. In terms of immigration, I don't think that the wall is a good issue for Democrats, because Trump's very persuasive on the wall, even though there's very little immigration coming from Mexico. Those sorts of facts don't matter. But when he says, look, we can build a big engineering project, we can do it, a lot of people go, well, why not? It's working for Israel. It's working in other parts of the world. To me, he's on much more vulnerable ground, interestingly, on the ban on Muslim immigration. And this goes against Americans' sense of fairness to apply a religious test for entry to the United States. People are paying enough attention to Orlando and these others to know that they were American citizens who committed these heinous acts and not, somebody who just got off the boat. And that he is, what he is doing, President Obama in Turkey last year described it as un-American. And Mark Kirk, a Republican senator from Illinois, said he couldn't support Donald Trump because his proposal on banning Muslims from the United States was un-American. And this represents a huge shift. It used to be that it was the progressives, or, who were accused of being subversives, and they were un-American. And now it's this idea. It actually, if you look at American history, it's not that un-American. I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese, Japanese immigrants were barred under later legislation in the early part of the 20th century. So there has been this kind of racist immigration restriction in the past in our country. But since the Immigration Act of 1965, which allowed large numbers of non-Europeans into the United States for the first time in almost 100 years. Since that time, we've had kind of a consensus that this is a nation of immigrants. It's a good thing. It's wrong to apply a religious test. It's wrong to be, racist. And so Trump is now challenging all that, and I don't think he's doing it successfully. And if we look back, I do believe he will likely lose, and if he does, I think we'll look at this as a reason why, that this is not in the American grain. Think about Muhammad Ali, when he died. Here's a guy, he's a Muslim. He almost went to jail for dodging, for not wanting to go to Vietnam. And yet, by the end of his life, he was in the American grain. And our country has changed, and we're not the country that we were when Eisenhower was president, or even that Reagan was president, not just demographically, but in our attitudes about what's in bounds. And Trump is out of bounds on this immigration issue, and I think it's going to hurt him.
I mean, that's one, just two, and then I'll finish this, but 2 points on the first part of what Jonathan was talking about, sort of domestically. And the numbers prove this out. In the last 35 years, Americans with a college degree have seen their incomes rise by something like 23%. Americans without a four-year college degree have seen their real income decline by 9%. And that group that has seen their income go down, they account for 7 in 10 Americans aged 25 or older. So that goes into the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, but it also goes into...
Wow, that's an amazing statistic. I never heard that before.
7
in 10 over age 25.
Yeah.
Wow.
So you have a lot of people looking for, what are you going to do for me? Where is my job? What is my future like? Will I own a house like my parents did? Will I, be able to send my kids to school, to college? Will they? I mean, there's a whole generation of people that will still be the first in their families to go to college. It's a huge number. On the wall and the ban, I have hope that there will be that same, what Jonathan talks a little bit about, that this is not what this country is about. When you look at the reality of what Trump proposes to ban anyone from countries that support terror in any way, you're looking at states that sponsor terror, safe havens, and then any country with any kind of jihadi group there operating. And those, you're talking about the UK, you're talking about France, you're talking about Belgium, 40 countries. Actually, the State Department, the last numbers, they had granted more than 2.7 million visas, 40 countries for people to come into this country. You're going to tell 2.7 million people they can't come in this country? I have hope that will be something that resonates with people.
The problem is there's so many things and it's hard for Hillary to choose what to go after. Whereas Trump, he has a great ability to keep it simple, and so where he can be very effective is, remember in the Indiana primary, he talked about how I called up Carrier and I said, if you deserted these people, you took your factory and you moved it to Mexico, and you're not going to be able to do that when I'm president. I will prevent you from doing that. And like, I almost found myself clapping, It's like, yeah, why are these companies taking jobs out of the United States? And Hillary has to take a hard line on things like, they're called corporate inversions, but they really should be called corporate desertions, when companies, incorporate overseas to avoid taxes. And there does have to be a much harder line on these companies. And if he can figure out in the debates how to keep the debate on that issue and appeal to those 7 and 10 who are doing worse, he's going to make this a close election.
And can get them out to vote, which he's been doing in the primaries. I know we have some time for questions, and we've raised several topics for discussion. I think we have microphones here, so let's see, right over here.
This election cycle, you have 2 presumptive nominees. One claims to be billionaire. There's a special qualification which Hillary brings us. She has been Secretary of State. Last time when you had several presidents who were Secretary of State before they became president goes back at the time of inception of United States. After George Washington, from John Adams to Quincy Adams, they were all Secretary of State before they were elected. Does that matter anything at all?
She's probably the best qualified person on paper to run for president in my lifetime. She's enormously well qualified. Her resume is terrific. I don't think, as I said before, that her resume matters that much to voters. In the same way, I don't think we haven't talked about Trump wanting Japan to go nuclear. It's terrifying to me. It's a terrible idea, but I don't think that matters very much to voters. They're more concerned about pocketbook issues and people who are speaking to their hearts and their economic interests.
He said he was misquoted on that. But.
Yeah.
Yeah, I echo that. Her resume is quite incredible. Unlike the second Bush, she does not have to name any names to ease voter concerns. She's not, although her team is, of course, has been in and out of her realm in various campaigns for a long time. So, I think that the question is, we ask this question all the time. What is it? What is her challenge? Those moments. Remember when she cried in New Hampshire in 2008?
Right.
And it was a moment. It was a moment for the news cycle for that week. But it stayed with me because it's like, good Lord, this woman, doing so much, and then just in that moment she sheds a tear, and it's the headline, and it's the real Hillary, and now we can empathize with her, and now she's not this machine, a political machine. I think so far, one thing I take away from the Trump-Clinton, battle so far is that we're not really talking about the fact that she's a woman. That's not, and that could be a good thing. That could be a refreshing thing.
It kind of took, yeah.
I was just going to say, it's we don't know. We're in uncharted territory. We don't know how much misogyny there is out there. You can't poll for it, really, because it may be that a lot of men are willing to vote for a woman for Senate, but not for president. We don't know. In the same way with Obama, we didn't really know until he was elected how many, and there are also a lot of women who don't like Hillary for complicated reasons. Just one quick thing on the Secretary of State. If Trump gets traction on the emails, the Hillary emails, that would mean that he used her time as Secretary of State against her, and it was actually a negative for her. And I guess at this point you'd have to say that it is a negative, since that's a big part of his campaign. You're going to be hearing about that him calling. It'll be interesting to see whether he calls her crooked Hillary to her face or not in the debates.
Jonathan, do you think voters understand that, or do you think that it's a headline that resonates that's, oh, lying again, or not trustworthy? But
No,
do the
emails?
deeper issue resonates with voters?
I think it's a good issue for him because he can say that she violated State Department rules and that others have gone to jail for what she did. She jeopardized our national security. She did make a mistake, and she did handle it badly when it first arose. And he will try to inflate that into something much bigger. And it remains to be seen how successful that is. I mean, I'm more disturbed by her poor judgment in taking those fees from Goldman Sachs at a time she knew she was going to be running for president in an environment where, a lot of people have lost their jobs and don't really appreciate her taking 6 figures for an hour's work. And I just thought that was really tone deaf on her part to take those fees. But Trump is on the offensive a lot. And as you mentioned earlier, big question that we won't know until the fall is how does she respond in a debate? She was very good against Obama in 2008 in the debates. She won most of her debates against Obama, but this is a different situation, and it's on a different plane, and he is very skillful when he's on the attack, as we saw. I sat through all those debates in the primaries. He is very, very tough, and so we won't know. I mean, I think the ratings will be huge for those 3 debates this fall.
Let's take another question. Up here, go here, and then.
John, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Fuji from Happy Science Group. My question is, do you think a Republican Party can unite to support Mr. Trump until November? I'm a little bit skeptical about that because some Republican figures, even now, seem to remain opposed to him on some issues, such as gun controls and so on. Thank you.
So can the Republican Party unify around Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really difficult question. Paul Ryan alone, it's almost painful to watch what he's been going through and what he's been, it's not an easy job. I mean, I think we have to see what happens in the days and weeks ahead. I mean, just this week, Trump coming out to say he's going to meet with the NRA to discuss whether or not those on the no-fly list should be banned from being able to purchase a gun. That's a restriction the NRA and the majority of the GOP have long opposed, of course. But so what's the fallout of that? How does it hurt him? First of all, the last I read, the NRA, there was no meeting scheduled. I mean, we don't even know, so I don't know if that's actually going to be a reality. But, how much does it hurt him to go ahead and say those things? And what does the Republican Party do with a candidate who comes out of left field on major issues?
Well, there's been a continuing debate among Republican elites on this, right? There was a piece just by Robert Kagan, I think, in the Washington Post today, saying the checks and balances won't contain Donald Trump. But then there are others who are, well, even Senator Corker's kind of taken a step back with the most recent comments.
Just a couple of things. I mean, I didn't want this to end without my telling I've only spent time with Trump twice, but in 1990, he threatened to sue me, which he's done a million times, so it's not exactly a big distinction. I was in a documentary about him that didn't even come out until last year. It was finally released 25 years later, called Trump, What's the Deal? It's worth watching, actually, because it's about his real estate business and his years in New York. But what I said in the film was that it reminded me of this with the NRA because Gorbachev came to New York as part of a visit when he was in charge in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. And for weeks before the visit, Trump said, Gorbachev's going to come to Trump Tower. I'm looking forward to meeting with him. I have a meeting with Premier Gorbachev. And Gorbachev's visit and his meeting with Reagan, came and went. And a couple weeks later, I called the Soviet embassy in the U.S. State Department. And I said, why was the Donald Trump meeting with Gorbachev canceled? And they said, it was never canceled. It was never scheduled. It wasn't going to ever, it was never a possibility. Why would we take Gorbachev to Trump Tower? And so he says these things, I'll have a meeting with the NRA, and then he figures rightly that people will forget about it and everybody will move on to the next news cycle. Your point about the divided Republicans is a very big one, and really in many ways the big story of this year is not Donald Trump, who could be a flash in the pan and gone. It's what's the future of the Republican Party going to be, and is it going to essentially crack up over this? And it's a great political story to cover, and the Cleveland Convention is going to be fascinating. Where I get upset with certain Republicans is when they put their party ahead of their country. So take somebody like Marco Rubio. He said in the primaries that Donald Trump was, quote, a con man. Marco Rubio's words, a con man. Then a couple of weeks ago, he said he would be honored to speak on Trump's behalf at the convention. So that raises the question, did something happen in the last 6 to 8 weeks to show that he was not a con man? Was Rubio convinced, I was mistaken? He's not a con man. He's actually a man of great character and upstanding, be a great president of the United States. If that's not the case, if no such evidence was presented to Marco Rubio, he is now in the position of supporting somebody he believes to be a con man to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I cannot think of any more succinct description of an unpatriotic American than somebody who would knowingly put a con man in charge of our Constitution. If you don't think he's a con man, if you think he's a great guy, you love him, then there's nothing unpatriotic about supporting him. But if you think he's a con man, you can't have both.
Right.
You can't both think one and think he should be president of the United States. So anyway, that's the quandary that a lot of Republicans are in, and it's a character test for every Republican. It's a time of moral reckoning for every Republican. What do they put first? Their party or what they know and believe about the character of Donald Trump?
And I think the significant move we've seen so far, or one move, has been to put Romney out, who has so little at stake. So when we start seeing Republicans who have something at stake, that will be a moment of moral measure.
Yes.
What does Romney have to lose?
Yeah, but I respect
politically.
Romney
I do too.
for stepping forward, and it's a great test, and I think it will affect a lot of these guys moving forward, how they deal with it. Right now, they think that they're in a quandary, and they're going through an anguished period, and I do feel sorry for a lot of them. They don't know what to do right now.
Okay.
John,
Please.
yeah.
Go.
Just to give Democratic unity or disunity equal time here, two other possible aspects of Trump's road, as you will. One is, how do you feel his appeal is, crossover appeal to Democrats there are many Democrats in really important swing states that are just as disaffected, just as angry about their economic situation, just as mad about what's happening to America abroad. What is Trump's appeal to them? And two, young people, particularly those that are so energized by Bernie Sanders, do they stay home? They don't particularly love Hillary, and it's common wisdom that the lower the turnout, that helps the Republicans the most. So I was wondering.
Yeah.
Right.
Good question.
I mean, I think I'll take one issue before tossing it over to Jonathan on that. I think it will be tricky because as someone who would be considering Trump, you look at an issue like abortion, and he's on the record as being pro-choice for many, many years. Now he's backed off of that, and we'll see how far off
he backs, but it'll take a savvy voter to really be able to put the positives and negatives in two columns next to each other and make a decision about going to Trump. My inclination is it will be hard. I don't think it's that likely, but I don't think it's impossible.
So first, I just wanted to salute John Wheeler, who asked the question. And when I went as a Japan Society fellow more than 20 years ago, and John was running the place at the time. He did a great job. I loved the Japan Society, and I didn't want the evening to end without my saying that and how much I got out of and continue to get out of my association with the Japan Society. I think you put your finger on the big electoral question. You know, the only way Trump wins is if he wins states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, and the only way he wins those is if he wins a certain number of blue-collar Democrats. I went to a Hillary rally and saw some union leaders there and was talking to them, and they acknowledged that a lot of their rank and file are for Trump, which is not a good sign for Hillary. And now, can some of them be brought back? Yes. The young people, the danger is not that they would vote for Trump, but that they just, as you mentioned, they wouldn't vote. And so there's a big challenge on the Democratic side. The negotiations between the Hillary and Bernie forces are going on right now. She's going to have to make certain concessions to him. And then his response, the enthusiasm with which he supports Hillary, is very, very important electorally in terms of especially younger people coming out and voting for her. I'm writing a book about Jimmy Carter right now, and in 1980, Ted Kennedy ran against him in the primaries, and then, gave a speech at the convention that was very popular, and fought right up to the convention, and then that wasn't so bad because that's been done a number of times. What really was a problem was that on the last night of the convention, when he came up on the stage with Carter, he was sulking. And he wouldn't raise President Carter's hand up, in a sign of unity. And Carter had to kind of chase him around the stage. And it was, the visuals were horrible for Carter. Because if you're going to win, you really do have to have a united party. And that's why the Democrats right now have the advantage going into the election, because the odds of their party being united are greater than the odds of the Republican Party being united.
I regret that we're going to have to close with that comment, but please join me in thanking the panelists for a very lively and effective discussion.